Imagine a detailed blueprint, already drafted, ready to go on day one of a new administration. Not just for minor tweaks, but to, well, completely dismantle and rebuild the federal government, department by department. That's exactly what we're diving into today. We're unpacking these comprehensive policy roadmaps from major conservative organizations. Think of it as a strategy guide with hundreds of specific recommendations aimed at fundamentally reshaping the executive branch. Now, the sources frame this whole effort against a pretty stark backdrop. They describe the current moment as an era of division and danger, comparing it to the late 1970s.
That comparison is deliberate. They point to issues like runaway inflation hitting families hard, rising drug overdose deaths.
And they also mention things like what they term the toxic normalization of transgenderism in schools.
Exactly. And internationally, the major threat identified is, quote, a totalitarian communist dictatorship in Beijing, which they argue is waging a kind of Cold War against the U.S. strategic, cultural, economic.
It sounds like a response to a perceived crisis.
It is. And the scale is significant. This isn't just a pamphlet. The main source book we're looking at involved over 400 scholars. The stated goal: rescue our kids, reclaim our culture, revive our economy, and defeat the anti-American left at home and abroad.
That's quite a mission statement.
It is, and there's a historical parallel they're aiming for. They explicitly mention wanting to replicate the success of the 1981 Mandate for Leadership, which advised the Reagan administration. Apparently, Reagan implemented something like 60% of those recommendations.
Okay, so it's more than just policy ideas on paper. How do they envision actually making such huge changes happen? Is it just about the recommendations themselves?
No, and this is crucial. It goes beyond the policy book. Part of this project involves creating this huge pre-vetted database. We're talking thousands of potential personnel ready to step into key political appointee roles across the government.
So it's about staffing too.
Precisely. It's a centralized effort to ensure that from hour one, the people implementing the policies are philosophically aligned with this vision of institutional reform. That's what makes this different, the operational readiness aspect.
Got it. So let's unpack the core philosophy behind all these proposed actions. What's the central value they believe needs restoring?
At the heart of it, they argue, the number one priority of politics must be the well-being of the American family. Everything else seems to flow from that principle.
A strong focus on the family. And that seems positioned against, well, big government, right? How do they propose tackling what they call the administrative state? Can executive power alone really unwind decades of bureaucracy?
Well, they draw a sharp contrast. They talk about community things like marriage, family, church, work as distinct from government. The argument is that centralizing political power often ends up, quote, subverting the family.
So the target is the bureaucracy itself.
Yes, the modern federal bureaucracy, the administrative state. They claim it pushes its own agenda, often influenced by what they describe as a radical, supposedly woke faction.
And the proposed solution?
Aggressive use of executive power. The idea is for the next president to use every available tool to, as they put it, handcuff the bureaucracy, and also to actively defang and defund these woke culture warriors they believe have infiltrated institutions. The aim is to restore power back to the people away from Washington, D.C.
Okay, and how does this translate into specific actions for key departments?
Yeah.
You mentioned HHS and DOJ earlier.
Right. So post-Dobbs, the mandate for HHS is crystal clear. Push for the most robust protections for the unborn possible under the law, and strictly enforce existing bans on federal funding for abortion.
Is there a specific financial target mentioned?
Yes. They explicitly point to organizations like Planned Parenthood, citing over $633 million in government funding received in one recent period, and the plan advocates prohibiting that funding completely.
And for the Department of Justice. A shift in focus there, too.
A dramatic one, according to the plan. The DOJ should prioritize targeting violent criminals and career criminals. They contrast this with what they perceive as the targeting of parents who were critical of local school boards. The sources argue those parents were unfairly scrutinized. And interestingly, they call for restarting the China Initiative from the Trump administration, specifically to combat Chinese espionage and intellectual property theft more rigorously.
Okay, so if the family is the starting point, let's talk about economics and self-sufficiency. The vision is described as opportunity through empowerment. What does that mean in practice?
It means tackling the welfare system. The core critique is that current federal policies, despite costing, a fortune, actually create what they call a dependency trap.
A dependency trap. How so?
The goal, they say, should be removing obstacles to work, not accidentally punishing people for trying to get ahead.
And they use data to back this up, right? I
Yeah.
remember seeing a specific example.
They do. It's quite striking. They use a scenario, a single parent in Chicago working full-time, earning $15 an hour.
Okay. They calculate that because of how benefits phase out across something like 80 different federal programs, costing about $1 trillion annually, this worker can actually see their total net income drop significantly as they earn more money.
Rob, how much?
Well, the example shows income peaking around $62,000, including benefits, but then falling off a cliff down to a trough of maybe $40,000 as higher earnings trigger the loss of stacked benefits, food stamps, housing aid, child care support, things like that.
Wow, a $22,000 disincentive to earn more.
Exactly. And that, according to the sources, is the trap. It discourages work, discourages higher wages, and keeps people reliant on the system. So the goal is to eliminate those cliffs.
That really clarifies the motivation. Now, what about education? The focus seems to be decentralization and choice. What's the main tool they propose?
The big one is education savings accounts, or ESAs. They point to models like Arizona's, where families get a large portion, maybe 90% of the state's per-student funding.
And families control that money. Yes, they can direct it to approved options. Private school tuition, tutoring, online learning, special therapies, whatever fits their child's needs.
And the critique of the current federal role
Is that it's become too entangled. All these complex funding streams, competitive grants, they argue it just leads to considerable bureaucratic bloat at the state and local level.
So what should the federal role be, according to this plan?
Minimal. Basically just a statistics gathering agency. That's it. Everything else related to K-12 education, they argue, should go back to the states and ultimately to families.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the global stage, national security. The sources are very clear about China, calling it a strategic, cultural, and economic Cold War. They say current policy has demonstrably failed. What's the immediate military concern?
It's framed as historic and urgent. They highlight China's massive military buildup, especially its nuclear forces, warning they could potentially match or exceed America's own nuclear arsenal.
That's a serious claim.
It is. And the immediate priority, they state, is ensuring the U.S. can maintain a denial defense. That means having the clear capability to stop Beijing from forcibly taking Taiwan or dominating key allies like South Korea and Japan.
And what about the U.S. military itself? The Department of Defense? The critique seems quite harsh.
It's severe. The plan calls the DoD a deeply troubled institution. The core accusation is that it's become too focused on, quote, leftist politics over military readiness.
And they have evidence for this claim.
They point to a specific, alarming statistic. Military recruiting in 2022 was apparently the worst in 2 generations.
Worst in 2 generations. How do they connect that recruiting crisis to these internal cultural issues they mentioned?
They draw a direct line. The proposed reforms include banning things like critical race theory or CRT instruction within the military. They also suggest eliminating tenure for professors at military academies.
Interesting. Anything else?
Yes. They also call for reversing policies that allow transgender individuals to serve openly. The argument presented is that these policies detract from the core mission of defense readiness and alienate potential recruits from more traditional backgrounds.
Okay. Turning to the homeland. Border security seems like a major focus for the Department of Homeland Security, DHS.
Absolutely. The plan mandates that DHS must return to its right mission, and that mission, according to these sources, is primarily border security and immigration enforcement. That means detention and deportation are priorities.
How do they propose making enforcement more effective?
Well, part of it is structural consolidating the various fragmented immigration agencies into one for better efficiency. But there are specific legal changes demanded too.
Yes.
2 key ones. First, they require implementing the Remain in Mexico Act, the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, which made asylum seekers wait in Mexico.
Okay, and the second?
Repealing a specific part of a law, Section 235 of the TVPRA.
The Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, Section 235. What does that do, and why is repealing it so important to this plan?
Right, so Section 235 currently says that unaccompanied minors arriving from countries that don't border the U.S., so not Canada or Mexico, Can't just be quickly sent back. They have to be put into shelters and go through formal deportation proceedings.
I see.
The argument in the blueprint is that this specific rule has unintentionally created a massive incentive for miners from Central and South America, for instance, to make the dangerous journey knowing they won't be immediately returned. They claim it makes them vulnerable to trafficking.
So repealing it, in their view, would reduce that incentive and allow for faster repatriation.
That's the stated rationale, yes. Reduce the pull factor.
All right, let's pivot to energy and the economy. There seems to be a major proposed shift away from climate policies.
Definitely. The goal articulated is achieving American energy dominance and making that a central pillar of foreign policy. This means the Department of Energy, the DOE, needs to shift its focus away from what the plan calls decarbonization.
And they target specific programs, labeling them climate fanaticism.
Yes, they do. The plan calls for eliminating or drastically reforming offices they believe distort energy markets by subsidizing politically favored technologies or companies.
Which offices are those?
Examples given include the DOE's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, OC, that's the one funding big first-of-a-kind clean energy projects, and the DOE Loan Program, which gives loan guarantees. The criticism is that these programs pick winners and losers, undermine market reliability, and waste taxpayer money.
Beyond energy policy, there's a strong emphasis on fiscal discipline overall, right? Connecting debt to national security.
A very strong emphasis. The national debt is framed as potentially the single greatest threat to national security. So the blueprint pushes hard for fiscal restraint, most notably by proposing a balanced budget amendment, or BBA.
A balanced budget amendment. What would that actually entail, according to this plan?
It's pretty specific. It would constitutionally bar annual federal spending from exceeding 20% of the gross domestic product, the GDP. And, crucially, it would prevent Congress from using tax hikes as the primary way to achieve balance.
So it forces spending cuts, not tax increases.
That's the intent embedded in the proposal, yes. Force Congress to make choices about spending levels.
And finally, agriculture. There are changes proposed for the USDA as well.
Yes, a fundamental restructuring, actually. The plan suggests separating nutrition assistance programs, things like SNAP or food stamps, which apparently make up about 80% of the Farm Bill's cost, from the Farm Bill itself.
Why separate them?
The argument is that this would allow the USDA to refocus purely on its core agricultural mission, supporting efficient food production and farmers. They argue the current structure mixes welfare with agriculture and leads to what they call climate-smart central planning, expanding bureaucracy unnecessarily.
So just to synthesize all this for our listener, this is really a comprehensive top-to-bottom blueprint for overhauling the entire federal government based on a specific conservative philosophy.
Absolutely. You can see the unifying themes. Empowering the family unit through economic freedom and school choice, rolling back the power of the administrative state, aiming for global energy dominance, and taking a very assertive stance on national security, especially regarding China.
And for you listening, understanding this framework is pretty crucial if you want to grasp the kind of deep structural changes being planned and prepared by conservative policy circles for potentially the very near future. We're not just talking about adjusting budgets here. It's about fundamentally altering the relationship between Washington, D.C. and the average American.
Yeah, the level of detail is quite remarkable. It goes down to recommending the elimination of smaller agencies like the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, or even moving the Coast Guard back to the Treasury Department from Homeland Security, where it used to be in peacetime before the 1960s.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to consider. If a plan like this, aiming to eliminate or consolidate every federal function deemed inefficient, unnecessary, or ideologically compromised by its authors, were actually implemented, what essential minimal role would be left for the federal government in the day-to-day life of an American? And perhaps more importantly, who would be left to carry out even that minimal role?